Last week on the dividing line, I sort of on the fly played a video that was being promoted in social media um, on the subject of Islam. It was an Islamic video, and I had not actually seen it yet. I uh, been linked to it right before the program started, and so sort of gave a response on the fly. Well, the individuals involved with it, specifically Abu Zakariyah, is one who put it out, and they're part of a group called Muslim Apologetics Podcast with Ayoub, who put out the video that I had interacted with, I don't know, about a year ago, that had made similar types of arguments. Very good in graphic presentation. They were very similar presentations. And so I responded, I played the whole thing and then just gave my honest interactions with it. And they did a podcast, the two Abus, um, did a podcast response and linked me to it. And they want to have some interaction. That'd be great. We'll definitely do that on their podcast and on the dividing line. That's fine. But I was just really disappointed with the response. Uh, in general, there was just not a lot of really hearing what I was saying. There was a lot of filtering, and we all do that. We filter through what we're familiar with and what our position demands of us, and it's the rare person that can get past that, really. But what I was really concerned about was, well, a lot of things. But I wanted in this video to just look at one area, which, I criticized the fact that the video once again brought up the fig tree argument. And I've said the fig tree argument is simply the worst apologetics argument that Islam's ever dreamed up. And I stand by that. And somehow, even these two young men who are clearly talented, intelligent young men, they're not getting it. They don't see why. And it seems pretty clear to everybody else, but for some reason they are struggling to understand why this is such a bad argument. And so I wanted to talk about a little bit about the issue of the knowledge of Christ, and especially the argument of the fig tree and the woman who touches Jesus. These are arguments we've dealt with before, but they are so common that I felt it would be useful to respond to these things. So let's take a look at them, and hopefully this will be helpful to folks along the way in trying to understand what is being said. Let's begin with the issue of the fig tree. My Muslim friends certainly would recognize that in interpreting surahs of the Quran, especially surahs where there is actually some indication of what its historical context is, that context would be important to bring into consideration. For example, some of the surahs, the background is one of the battles, famous battles of the people of Medina versus Mecca, and so on and so forth. And in those situations, that kind of information is brought to bear in understanding what is being said in the surah. Well, when you look at Mark chapter 11, we're getting right down toward the end of Mark's gospel. We're coming right into the Passion Week narrative. And the conflict between Jesus and the Jewish leadership is at its height. And all the Gospels, and especially the Synoptic Gospels, agree that it is during this time that Jesus pronounces his woes upon the Jewish leaders. You have the Olivet Discourse. And much of this is focused upon the coming judgment upon the people of Israel and the destruction of the temple. And in fact, the way that Mark does this, unlike Matthew's version, which again, Matthew telescopes what Mark expands out. In Mark's version, the cleansing of the temple takes place between the cursing and then the interpretation of it, or the fact that they see that the tree has withered. And so it's just so painfully obvious that if you're trying to understand Mark, now if you're, the funny thing is, they as we will play, they will accuse me of coming at this from the Trinitarian perspective, so I hear what I want to hear. The problem is, who's doing the actual exegesis here? If you're trying to understand Mark, then you're going to recognize that there is a reason. When you compare Mark to Matthew, and Mark gives the initial encounter with the tree, they go in, there's the cleansing of the temple, there's statements concerning about, my house should be called a house of prayer for the nations. You've made a robber's den. You've got the, chief priests and the scribes, and they're seeking how to destroy him. And then going out, they see the fig tree is withered. It's very obvious that Mark is trying to communicate something to us here. So here's the text. The next day, when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. Seeing it at a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples were listening. And then they have the encounter in Jerusalem, beginning at verse 15. Then beginning at verse 19, when evening came, they would go out of the city. As they were passing by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots up. Being reminded, Peter said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed is withered." Jesus answered, saying to them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says this mountain, be taken up and cast in the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes what he says is going to happen, it will be granted to him." And then you've got a whole discussion of not only what Christian prayer is to be, but it's in contrast to the false views of prayer that were being practiced by the Jews for the public adoration of their holiness and piety and so on and so forth. Jesus doesn't really take the time to satisfy their curiosity in regards to the fig tree. So the argument that is presented by our Muslim friends really on its face is, again, really hard to understand how anyone could come up with this. Jesus is 30 some odd years of age. He's not an out-of-towner. I suppose if he had always lived his life in a place where there weren't any fig trees, he might not know when the fig was in season, but do you really, really think that this prophet of God was so dull, so out of it, that he didn't know what season there is for figs? I mean, you really want to go there? You really think that's what Mark was communicating? That Mark puts us in there so that we can know that Jesus was ignorant of agriculture. That was the point. And he puts the cleansing of the temple in between ignorance of agriculture. Really? I'm sorry. It's just really hard to have respect for that. It's just, there's just obviously something else going on here. And when you go on in Mark and Jesus says, learn the lesson of the fig tree, and he's talking about Israel and stuff, it becomes really clear and rather compelling that the cursing of the, and in fact, that's, I just sort of went by that real quickly. But if you go to Mark 13:28, from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. What does that mean? This is the same author. He's using the same illustration. Here Jesus knows, wow, all about the agriculture he didn't know about before. Isn't that interesting? And what's he talking about? The destruction of Jerusalem by Titus and the Roman legion. So any I know this sounds extreme, but it's quite true. Any honest interpreter who simply sits back and says, I want to know what Mark meant, is given plenty of information. Plenty of information to understand exactly what was going on in the cursing of the fig tree. And to take that and say, well, see, Jesus couldn't have been God incarnate, didn't even know when figs were on trees, it's insulting to Jesus and insulting to Mark. And it just, I'm sorry, y'all need to abandon this. It's not a meaningful argument by any stretch of the imagination. There's another that came up in this, and that's Mark chapter 5. And it's the healing of Jairus' daughter, a text that I've spoken on many, many times as, I think, one of the best illustrations of the relationship between Matthew and Mark, synoptic studies, telescoping, all that kind of neat, fun stuff. And specifically here, though, in Mark 5:24, Jesus has gone off with Jairus. A large crowd is following him, pressing on him. A woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak, for she thought, if I just touch his garments, I will get well. Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Now, let me just stop for a moment. Do you really think one who has this kind of power to heal turned around and said, what happened? Who is that? Who is that? I don't know who that was. I need to know who that was. That's you consider that a good reading of what Mark is recording for us here? Well, let's see what happens. And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Now, here's Jesus. He's going to raise Jairus' daughter from the dead. He knows what he's going to do. Even though that's not actually their knowledge yet, because when you look at the parallel in Matthew and Luke, both agree that the actual words of Jairus to Jesus was, she's about to die, and then the men come and inform them in the next verse, 5:35, that she has died, so that when they get there, they know that that is what has taken place. Matthew just puts all that together. He's going to raise a child from the dead, and a woman touches him, and the point is that he's now confused. Where is the indication anywhere in here that Jesus is not in full control of what's going on? Why does he ask and then ignore his disciples? Why does he ask to bring forth her confession of faith? She comes and bows down before him. He stops and he asks a question that seems to his disciples to be silly. I mean, who touched you? There's people all around you. But there was only one touch, and Jesus knew what the touch was, and he knew what he was doing, so that he could minister to this woman. Now, both of these are so obvious that the question has to be asked, why would intelligent people continue to, well, really abuse these texts? And it's obvious. You, as Muslims, you have a tradition. And now it's interesting. This is not a Quranic argument. The Quran doesn't force you to do this. The Quran doesn't know anything about these stories. The author of the Quran didn't know anything about these stories. I mean, these would have been the perfect stories to cite if you were going to have some authoritative Quranic interpretation and argument against the deity of Christ. But it's just painfully obvious to me that the author of the Quran did not understand the content of the New Testament, did not have access to it, understanding of it, anything like that. So this, but you still have to come up with these arguments. And as far as ignorance of Jesus, well, you don't have much, because there's all these other places in the Gospel of Mark, for example, where Jesus knows what men are thinking within their hearts, and he has this supernatural knowledge of things, and so you're sort of stuck with a small amount of stuff to go for. And so, but gentlemen, you're not exegeting the text of Mark. You cannot look at yourself in the mirror and say, you know what? My first priority is to really accurately understand what Mark intended to communicate here. No, it's not. That's not what you're doing with the text. Sorry. So it was disappointing then to hear the statements. But let's listen to the statements and interact a little bit with them here.
All right. So on the final note, that let's go over the issue of Jesus and his knowledge and how the Bible actually depicts what he knows. James White in the video, he said, well, the passage of the fig tree, that this is metaphorical, okay, and that there's an interpretation for it, that this is supposed to mean Israel and them being cursed or what have you.
Well, you have to respond to that, because I've given you so much evidence. The Mark 13 usage of the same metaphor for Israel, judgment, the breaking up of the text around the encounter with the Jewish leaders, the cleansing of the temple. I've given you so much. You can't just dismiss that. Can you give counter-argumentation? Can you give counter-exegesis? No, you can't. So what would it take for you to go, you know what? You're right, it's a bad argument. What would it take? What would the evidence require?
What we find, though, and I'd like you to touch upon this, this isn't the only case. You talked about, you only had so much time to give some examples, and so you're giving one example, and I think it's quite disingenuous from James White's perspective to actually act like this was the only time that this was done. And
wait, what do you mean disingenuous? I have said that this is a horrific argument, and it is. It involves eisegesis. It is not exegetical. It is not a meaningful, scholarly, honest handling of the biblical text. It doesn't matter whether you're a Muslim, an atheist, a Mormon, a Jehovah's Witness. I don't care who it is. It's not a meaningful handling of the text. And I call upon everybody to handle everybody's text in a meaningful fashion. Okay? I've written an entire book on the Quran. Where did I manhandle the text of the Quran the way you're manhandling the text of Mark? Where? Maybe that's something we could discuss, but I haven't seen anyone pointing to anything like that. So why is it disingenuous of me? It was the only example presented in the video, and it's a bad example. It doesn't work. It doesn't prove the point. It's in error. So why is that disingenuous on my part? Why get personal and express it in that way? I don't understand it.
From what I've read in the Bible, and even in the Old Testament as well, there, in comparison to the Islamic view of God, it's quite low. So God does things that are quite humanistic.
Quite low. So the idea being evidently that an utterly transcendent God, that's a high view. But if God is actually involved in his creation, now, of course, I could take you to sections of Isaiah and Jeremiah that I just don't believe there's anything even close to that high in the Quran. But I do find this kind of language, a low view of God, just want to bring out what it's about. It's, high view is transcendent, not involved, not sullying himself in his creation. And I reject, obviously the Christian message is the high view of God is the God who condescends in mercy and grace. So it's a both and you've only got one half of that. We've got both.
Even in the Old Testament. So you have in Genesis God coming down to the garden and asking Adam, "Where are you?" Right? So in Islamic theology, we say that God says these things because he's usually, when he asks a question, because he knows these questions are going to be written in Revelation, in history. So to give somewhat of a dialogue, he will ask the question. It's not that he doesn't know it. It's a question to get the answer.
Which is exactly what Jesus did with the woman, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. You just gave the proper interpretation of a text that then you're not going to be willing to use the same thinking on later on.
Right? But what we find with Jesus's depiction, even in the Old Testament as well, when God came down and he said, "Where are you?" And apparently Jesus, according to Christian theology or their commentaries, it was actually Jesus that went into Adam and made him reply to God.
Well, yeah, the one who has been seen. No one has seen God any time. The Nagones Theos, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. So the one that Jacob wrestled with, the pre-incarnate theophanies of the Son, that is his role, is the revelation of the Father.
So that's quite odd. I just ran across that, but when you're looking at the New Testament, this person, this individual, Jesus, that's supposed to be God incarnate, fine. I mean, if we were to actually imagine this picture of a person that's supposed to be God incarnate.
Now, who's supposed to be God incarnate. And now we're going to get a description of what you think God in flesh is supposed to be like. You can't even begin, I'm sorry, but you can't even begin to honestly engage this hypothetical for one really obvious glowing reason. And that is the reason for the incarnation is the gospel. It is the self-glorification of the triune God and the salvation of particular people through the incarnation, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You don't believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Hence, any hypothetical theories that you're going to come up with in regards to what the God-man is supposed to look like, it's going to be irrelevant. Because Jesus was doing what he was doing. He said, "It is necessary that I go to Jerusalem." So all this stuff about, well, what the God-man had been like is irrelevant, and it misses the point of why Jesus acted and did the thing, why he acted the way he did, and why he did the things he did. Because it's not gospel-centered. You don't have the core. And I know why you don't, because the author of the Quran didn't know any of these things. He was ignorant of these things. He did not know the gospel, did not know the content of the New Testament. And so he could not interact with it in a meaningful fashion. So when you take that as your ultimate authority, and then through that lens of ignorance that filters out the content of the New Testament, look at the New Testament, well, it doesn't really make much sense.
For a person that never picked up the Bible, what would be, if they were to approach this issue from a hermeneutical perspective, meaning that you're coming with a theology of who God is, and you want to try to picture what God would be as an incarnate person. It's clear as day that the character of Jesus he doesn't characterize what a God-man would be, even if that was the case, philosophically or theoretically.
Theoretically, on what basis? Because you said you came with a theology. If you come with the theology of Isaiah 53 and the suffering servant, then he's exactly what you expect. Because he's accomplishing exactly what he was sent to accomplish. See, you're just, I'm sorry, but this isn't even relevant to really what's being discussed.
And on a number of occasions, we find that Jesus is saying he doesn't know what's going on around him. It's not just the fig tree. So, for instance, when you have him, when he was healing people, and he was walking, and then a woman went up, and she touched his garment, and she was healed. And Jesus turned around and said, "Who touched my garment?" He didn't know who it was, right?
No. Now we've just seen that. And in fact, if you applied what you just said about God asking Adam where he was to the same situation, that Jesus is asking this question to bring forth the confession of faith from the woman, then you wouldn't have even made this mistake. So there you go.
And then you had when Jesus calmed the storm. You know, the people had to wake Jesus up to let them know the storm, they're about to die.
Again, this isn't a matter of ignorance. Jesus is a human being who trusts the Father implicitly, and therefore he's resting. He's asleep. I know people like that, don't you? We believe that Jesus was truly man. I know you all just you all talked about the hypostatic union. You even defined it correctly a few times, but you will never follow through with it. We'll talk about that at another point, because I appreciated the fact that there was some accurate definition, but then when it came time to see if you would stick with that accurate definition and really provide a compelling argument against it, you just wouldn't do it. You just wouldn't do it. Let's look a little bit more at this. I'm going longer than I wanted to. I wanted to keep this under about 20 minutes. Sorry, 26. Sorry about that. Let me speed it up here a little bit.
Well, just using the fig tree incident as an example. This is a perfect illustration of not accepting what the text is telling you at face value and what the apparent meaning of the text. I mean, Mark is very clear in what he's saying. Jesus was hungry. He saw a fig tree and he went to approach it to find out if it had any fruit. Where does the text say that he approached it to make a lesson out of it, or to as a metaphor about Israel? It gives the circumstances. He was hungry, and it gives you the reason why he approached the tree, to find out if it had any fruit. If he already knew that it didn't have any fruit, he wouldn't have to approach it. If he already knew that it wasn't the season for figs, he wouldn't have to approach it in the first place. So it's a perfect example of a clear and apparent meaning of a verse that's been turned into metaphor. And if you approach it with the mindset of Jesus is definitely God and he's all-knowing, then of course you're going to have to go down the route of metaphor, because if you don't, then it just destroys your whole belief system about Jesus.
So, in the same book, Jesus can accurately give information about the fig tree. And that accurate information actually tells us that having the leaves should have indicated the presence of fruit, which of course perfectly matches up with Israel looking like they have something that they don't. Mark cuts it up, gives the encounter. You have here those who will listen to Mark and carefully read him have no problems. But the plain meaning from Abu Zakariyah is the opposite. Who's really doing exegesis here? It's not Abu. You're doing this because you have an external authority. It's called eisegesis. And you are alleging something of the text that the author would never have indicated. And I think that is very, very clear. And I just wonder, can you all admit this? I mean, what level of information would you need to be able to admit, you know what? If we're going to be consistent, and we're going to ask that you handle the Quranic text in such a way as to allow for it to speak for itself, then, yeah, we don't really have the basis for making this argument. What would it take? That's really the question that I would have to ask. And so, much more to be said, but I wanted to respond to that particular portion and point out that when you actually go to the text, what you see and what you hear is very different than what's being reported by our Muslim friends, who obviously are intelligent young men. But what does this show? That this isn't a matter of intellect. In this instance, you have countermanding tradition. And in every instance, when it comes to obedience to the Word of God, it's a spiritual thing. It's a matter of submission. Yeah, submission. Yes, guys, I just use that term. We use it too. We used it before you did. Submission to God's revelation, which we know requires the work of the Holy Spirit of God. So I pray for Abu Ayoub and Abu Zakariyah, and I appreciate their response, and we'll have more conversation in the future, but I hope they'll consider what I've said here. If I have time, I also want to talk about John 17 in another video. But you know how long these things take to process and upload and stuff like that. So might do that in the Dividing Line, maybe in a conversation. In fact, let's do it that way. Let me just openly say right here, let me join you, you guys, on the MAP podcast. Let's talk about John 17. Can we do that? Because, you know, in the past, I've tried to get some Muslims to do just, you know, we tried to get Yusuf Ismail to do a thing where I did John 5 and he would do Surah 5. But he didn't want to. He wanted to do it more broadly than that. But let's look at John 17. I think that would be a great discussion. And maybe let me come up with a section from Surah 4, maybe, or maybe Surah 3, Surah 5. I'll look and see what would be best, and we'll have a conversation based on that. I think a lot of people would find that to be interesting. So let's think about it, and let's continue having the dialogue. And hopefully this has been useful to more than just us folks that are directly involved. Thanks for watching.